All right. Welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Yu Oyang, and I am an assistant professor of political science here at Purdue University Northwest. On behalf of the dean of our college, Dr. Elaine Carey, I want to thank you all for joining us today for the Distinguished Speaker Series offered by the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences here at Purdue University Northwest. Today, we are very glad to have with us Dr. George Edwards, who will speak to us about Donald Trump and presidential leadership. Dr. Edwards is a University Distinguished Professor of Political Science and the Jordan Chair in Presidential Studies Emeritus at Texas A&M University. He is also a Distinguished Fellow at the University of Oxford, a leading scholar of the presidency. Dr. Edwards has written or edited 26 books on American politics, as well as many journal articles. He is also the editor of the journal Presidential Studies Quarterly and the general editor of the Oxford Handbook of American Politics series. Professor Edwards has served as president of the Presidency Research Section of the American Political Science Association and held senior appointments at Oxford University, the University of London, Sciences Po in Paris, France, Peking University in China, Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel, and the United States Military Academy at West Point. The title of Dr. Edwards' talk today Is Donald Trump an Effective Leader? This is a fiery, timely subject with Election Day coming up in about 2 weeks' time. So Donald Trump took office possessing well-honed promotional talents sharpened over a lifetime of marketing himself and his brand. He also has years of experience in making deals and claimed to be an especially able negotiator. Thus, he claimed to be uniquely qualified to lead the country, unite the public, and overcome gridlock in Congress. How successful has the president been in accomplishing these tasks? Dr. Edwards will evaluate the president's performance and place it in a broader perspective on presidential leadership. Dr. Edwards, I know it is difficult to see over Zoom, but everyone please join me in a round of applause as we welcome Dr. Edwards to our virtual campus.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be talking to you today and to have a chance to share some thoughts about the presidency. And I want to thank you for his efforts in arranging today's talk. Now, today I'll be focused on the leadership of Donald Trump, but also use this discussion to make some general comments on the presidency itself. And these lessons will apply to presidents yet to come, no matter what happens on November 3rd. Now, I realize, of course, that Donald Trump is a highly controversial figure and a topic, and he's a polarizing figure. So let me make it clear that what I have to say today is true no matter what you think about building a wall along the southern border, or what you think about the duration of the pandemic, or any other policy of the Trump administration. Now, first we need to focus just for a minute on what leadership is. How do we know it when we see it, since we're talking about leadership? And leadership is perhaps the most commonly employed concept in politics, yet it's a very elusive concept. Writers and commentators employ the term leadership to mean just about everything a person who occupies what we often refer to as a position of leadership does or should do. When we define a term so broadly, I think it loses its utility. Now, we know that the Constitution and federal laws invest significant discretionary authority in the president. Making decisions and issuing commands, implementing policy are very important. And doing them well requires courage, wisdom, and skill. And at times, the exercise of unilateral authority, which is what I mean when you can just do it on your own, may result in historic changes in the politics and policy of the country. In the extreme case, the president can launch a nuclear attack at his discretion. The consequences would be vast, of course, but most people would not view such an act as one of leadership. And exercising discretionary authority, the president, in effect, acts alone. He doesn't have to lead anyone to do anything. So influencing others is central to the conception of leadership of most political scientists, and I think most people in general. We want to know whether the chief executive can affect the output of government by influencing the actions and attitudes of other people. In democracy, we're particularly attuned to efforts to persuade, especially when most potentially significant policy changes require the assent of multiple power holders. So today I want to focus on those who are not directly on the president's team, the public and Congress, and who are thus less obligated to support his initiatives. Now, Donald Trump provides an intriguing case for the study of presidential leadership. Despite his lack of credentials, or conventional credentials, I should say, for the presidency, he came to the White House with two sets of skills that seem relevant to leading the people and their government. First, as you said, he possessed well-honed promotional talents, ability sharpened over a lifetime of marketing himself and his brand, including a stint as a successful reality television star. He was undeniably skilled at attracting attention and thus dominating the media and political discourse. Second, Trump boasted of being an able negotiator. Announcing his candidacy for the presidency in 2015, he proclaimed, "If you can't make a good deal with a politician, then there's something wrong with you. We need a leader that wrote The Art of the Deal." And of course, that's a book that he wrote or co-wrote. So the future president claimed he was uniquely qualified to lead the country, unite the public, and overcome gridlock in Congress. So was this talented self-promoter able to win public support for his initiatives? Was this experienced negotiator able to overcome polarization in Congress and attain agreement on his proposals? In other words, was Donald Trump an effective leader? Well, let's look at the record. Now, we'll start with the public and leading the public. Every president desires the public's support because they feel it increases the chances of Congress responding to its initiatives. If you supported it, Congress will be more responsive. It increases their chances of being reelected, which they care about a lot, and it increases their chances of their party having success in congressional elections, which of course has an impact on whether or not their legislation will pass. Every president invests substantial time in obtaining this support, and every president starts with a core of supporters centered around those who share his party affiliation. Yet this base is typically too small to represent a majority of the public. The question is whether the president can persuade those outside his base to change their minds and support his initiatives. Now, if we look at history, there's overwhelming evidence that presidents rarely move the public in their direction. Most observers viewed Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton as excellent communicators, great communicators. Nevertheless, pluralities and often majorities of the public opposed them on most of their initiatives. Moreover, public opinion typically moved away from rather than toward the positions that they favored. Despite the favorable context of the national resulting from the September 11th terrorist attacks, despite the long-term disdain of the public for Saddam Hussein, and despite the lack of organized opposition, excuse me, George W. Bush made little headway in moving the public to support the war in Iraq. And once the war was over, the rally resulting from the quick U.S. victory quickly dissipated. Despite his eloquence, Despite his eloquence, Barack Obama could not obtain the public support for his initiatives that weren't already popular. For example, his healthcare reform lacked majority support even 5 years after it passed. Even Franklin Roosevelt, the president often viewed as the greatest politician of the 20th century, faced constant frustration in his efforts to move the public to prepare for entry into World War II. And his failure to persuade the public regarding his plan to pack the Supreme Court effectively marked the end of the New Deal, a point that's relevant today and perhaps next year. Now, Donald Trump came to office with more experience as a self-promoter and public personality than any previous chief executive. And at the core of his political success was his public relations skills. Before entering the Oval Office, He spent a lifetime promoting himself in his real estate ventures, and as you know, he was a reality television star. Shortly before his inauguration, he warned congressional Republicans that if the party faltered, he was ready to use the power of the presidency and the power of Twitter to usher his legislation to passage. The implication was that he could mobilize the public behind his policies and leverage that opinion to move Congress. But has he gained the public's backing for either his policies or his own handling of those policies? Well, let's look at three issues that dominated Trump's legislative agenda: healthcare, taxes, and immigration. And then add policies regarding international trade, which is another key issue in the Trump administration. And then we'll also add his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which clearly is the issue of 2020. Now, these five issues provide a best test case of the potential for opinion leadership. Because the healthcare policy the president sought to replace, the Affordable Care Act, had been unpopular since Congress passed it in 2010. Giving people a tax cut is hardly a politician's nightmare. There's a broad consensus on the importance of securing our borders and obeying immigration laws. And the president's argument that he was protecting American workers and businesses from unfair foreign competition was on its face quite appealing. And people typically rally around the president in crises such as the one we face right now. So our question again is, could his finely honed public relations skills move the public to support his policies? Well, the bottom line is the president has consistently failed to gain the public's backing for either his policies or his handling of them. Indeed, he seems to have turned the public in the opposite direction. He made an unpopular healthcare policy popular, and the healthcare policies that he backed unpopular. Obamacare was unpopular until Donald Trump opposed it, and virtually overnight, and it is literally virtually overnight, it became popular and remains popular. Trump managed to alienate the public from his immigration policies, from building a wall to granting asylum. The public has never supported building that wall. At the same time, he made a tax cut for nearly all taxpayers and nearly all businesses unpopular, which, if you think about it, is reasonably astonishing. In addition, the public remained supportive of free trade, but was critical of his handling of trade policy. And finally, the public has very clearly rejected the president's handling of the pandemic and does not trust his statements on it. Now, you may disagree with the public's evaluation, but that's not my point right now. My point is that's what the public thinks, and it has thought that for months. In addition, President Trump began with the lowest approval ratings of any new president in the history of polling, which now extends back more than 70 years. He's not been able to expand his support and thus his coalition. So although the president has maintained the support of his base, those who agreed with him before he took office, he faltered in leading others less inclined to offer their support. Now, some of his problems were no doubt his lack of competence in the art of governing, which is another question, and we can talk about that in question time if you like. But more broadly, it seems clear that the Trump presidency is another example of a president not being able to move the public to support his priority policies. But we should also note, as we think specifically about a specific president, that Donald Trump has done worse than we might expect. He's done worse in moving the public. So why do presidents find it so difficult to lead, and why has Donald Trump found it especially difficult? So I want to answer both of those questions. One's broad and one's more narrowly focused. So let's think about Trump, then we'll think about the broad question of presidential leadership, then we'll think about Trump again and leading. President Trump began with a weak strategic position. That's my phrase. And by that I mean that he lacked a mandate from the public. Clearly, he lacked a mandate because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes. So you can't claim a mandate if the people actually voted for your opponent. He also lacked a broad public support for his orientation towards policy. He has a particular orientation towards policy, but the public wasn't moving in that direction. If anything, it was moving in the other direction. He's also faced a highly polarized public. And when Democrats and Republicans are far apart, there's fewer people over here, if you're the president, who might swing to your side because they're so far away. This is a problem for any contemporary president. Moreover, the public is typically resistant to changing their minds. And let me talk about that for just a minute. Presidents find it difficult to focus the public's attention. They find it difficult to obtain an audience for their efforts at persuasion. They find it difficult to ensure that people who do pay attention don't miss their points, because you can pay attention to someone and not understand what they're talking about, and that happens all the time. They find it difficult to frame issues to their advantage. Moreover, committed, well-organized, and well-funded opponents are always offering competing frames. And presidents must overcome the public's predispositions to change people's minds about their policies or their performance. And those predispositions are very difficult to overcome. Most people, as we well know, seek out information confirming their pre-existing opinions, ignore or reject arguments contrary to their predispositions. When exposed to competing arguments, they typically accept the confirming ones and dismiss or argue against the opposing ones. This is one of the most well understood aspects of human psychology. People are also frequently misinformed as opposed to being uninformed about politics and about policy. And ironically, the most misinformed people are the most difficult to change. They are even firmer in their convictions. And there's nothing the president can do about these features of human nature and American politics. But there's something else. There's something else here, in addition to these broad factors that affect every president. So again, we're going to narrow in on President Trump. I think the content of what the president says and how he says it, his style, has been detrimental to his successfully leading the public. No president in modern times has been so willfully uninformed, so willing to rely on his instincts rather than careful analysis, so unconcerned with the accuracy of his statements, so critical of alternative sources of information, and so ready to violate the norms of civil discourse. Both the tone and the substance of Trump's public rhetoric are far beyond the norms of the presidency, Democrat or Republican. We can begin with his willingness to demean his opponents. The president's reflexive response to any opposition or criticism is ad hominem counterattacks. Unable to divorce disagreement from disrespect and recognize the differences between opponents and enemies, Trump, in the words of conservative commentator George Will, is incessantly splendid. He seems to have bottomless reserves of self-pity. So rather than focusing on promoting his policies, the president emphasizes labeling his opponents, attacking their character or motives, and peppering them with what I view as puerile taunts. The president is better at branding enemies than policies, however. Despite his skill at mocking people, it has not helped him increase public support for his policies, as we have seen. It doesn't work. This lack of impact is not surprising, because it's much more difficult to condense the case for complex policies in a hashtag than it is to ridicule individuals. Moreover, disparaging opponents is hardly conducive to attracting broad support or encouraging people, such as members of Congress, to work with him in the future. The president may reinforce the views of his followers with his branding, but he seems to persuade few people while alienating many others in the process. President Trump also often misleads the public about the nature of threats, ranging from climate change and Russia to the coronavirus, denying problems that people can experience for themselves or on which they have a great deal of solid information. And this decreases the trust among the public. When you deny a problem that the public sees really is a problem. The president also persistently prevaricates about people, about issues, nations, his policies, his accomplishments. He claims to be telling it like it is, but in reality, he's telling like it isn't. It's not surprising that the public does not view him as honest and trustworthy, and they never have. They never have. And that they don't respond to his entreaties for support. Why would you follow someone you can't believe? So he's undermined his own ability to lead the public with his style of public discourse. One of the least attractive aspects of the president's rhetoric, I think, is his stoking cultural divisions and racial tensions and cultivating tribalism. This approach seems to play well with his base, but plays very poorly with the rest of the nation. And finally, the president challenges bedrock principles of democracy. For example, at the core of every democracy is a commitment to the rule of law. Donald Trump has been at war with the rule of law throughout his presidency, vilifying a range of core institutions that were less than responsive to his wishes, including the courts, the FBI, the Department of Justice, the criminal justice system, even court-martial decisions. And he's made a remarkably unsystematic and self-serving use of pardons. He even wants to lock up his opponents in prison. All of these patterns of the president's rhetoric add a unique and I think disturbing element to American political life. They also decrease the public's willingness to follow his lead. He's undermined his own ability to lead. Well, now let me turn to Congress. Presidents invest an enormous amount of time trying to lead Congress because they know legacies are highly dependent on their proposals passing the legislature. Before I discuss Donald Trump, I want to tell you about successful presidential leadership of Congress. And we want to ask, were these successful presidents I'm about to tell you about, I'm going to give you two quick case studies. Were these presidents who blew into Washington, convinced everyone to make a deal, and then passed the legislation of their choice? Is that what they did? Well, let's see. Now, perhaps the 20th century's most famous period of presidential congressional relations was the 100 Days of 1933, when Congress passed 15 major pieces of legislation proposed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. FDR had won a big victory in 1932, and the Democrats gained large majorities in both houses of Congress. The day after his inauguration in 1933, FDR called a special session of Congress to deal with the economic crisis. And that was a time when Congress wasn't in session all the time, so they were home. He had to call them back to Washington. Now, what's interesting here is this. All they planned to ask from Congress was to pass three pieces of legislation. First, to regulate the resumption of banking. He had closed the banks 3 days after he took office. He needed to get them open so the economy could function effectively. The second piece of legislation had really nothing directly to do with the Great Depression. He wanted to amend the Volstead Act to legalize beer, which is a very popular policy, and it probably made it easier to deal with the Depression if you could have a drink from time to time, right? And he wanted to cut the budget. Well, so that's what he was going to do, and then send Congress home. He expected to reassemble the legislature when he was ready with more permanent and more constructive legislation. Now, the first piece of legislation Roosevelt proposed was a bill regarding the resumption of banking. He found that he didn't have to persuade anyone to support his bill, which passed unanimously in the House after only 38 minutes of debate and without a roll call vote. In fact, hardly anybody had actually seen the bill, but there's only one copy of the bill in the entire House of Representatives. And then it went to the Senate and passed 73-7, which had no copies of the bill. They simply passed whatever the House sent, okay? That's what they did. An hour later, the bill arrived at the White House for the president's signature. The whole affair took less than 8 hours, if you can imagine that. The whole affair of this very important piece of legislation. 8 hours from the White House to Congress, back to the White House. Much to his surprise, the president found the situation ripe for change. The country was in such a state of desperation that it was eager to follow a leader who would try something new. So FDR decided not to send Congress home, but to keep it in session and exploit the favorable environment by sending it the legislation that became known as the New Deal. And he went on to serve in the White House longer than anyone else, but most of those years were not legislatively productive. James McGregor Burns, a very famous biographer and a very admiring biographer of FDR, entitles his discussion of presidential congressional relations in the late 1930s and FDR's second term, he entitles this Deadlock on the Potomac. which captures the situation that FDR faced. Now, either Roosevelt had lost his persuasive skills, which I don't think is a reasonable proposition, and I know of no one who would argue that, or other factors are more significant in determining congressional support for the president. By 1937, despite the president's great election victory, his coalition was falling apart. I want to give you one other example. We're going to fast forward about 30 years to the Great Society. And the next great period of legislative productivity for a president was Lyndon Johnson's success with the 89th Congress, which was in 1965-1966. Now, the 1964 election occurred in the shadow of the traumatic national tragedy of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and Johnson won his smashing victory. With it, opposition to his policies melted. For the first and only time since the New Deal, liberals gained majorities in both houses of Congress. Johnson didn't have to convince these liberals to support policies that had been on their agenda for a generation. Medicare, which passed during this time, had been proposed in some form or another by Harry Truman. He even received substantial Republican support for some of his major initiatives. Civil rights was the most contentious issue of the time, and it was Johnson's political genius to realize that the time for change had arrived. He chose the moment when the civil rights movement was peaking in its appeal to the nation's conscience to pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965. This was a widely supported policy, however. Even some members of Congress from the South supported it. No one understood Congress better than LBJ, and he knew that his personal leadership could not sustain congressional support for his policies. He knew that, despite being a great congressional leader. He believed he had a rare window of opportunity in Congress, and he pushed as much legislation as possible through Congress to fully exploit the favorable political environment. And he told his aides, this is going to end. This will not last. It's not because I'm such a persuasive fellow. That's not why we're going to have success. In the 1966 midterm elections, the Democrats lost 47 seats in the House, 4 in the Senate. Legislating became much more difficult. 16 months later, in March 1968, the president declared he would not seek re-election. Johnson had lost neither his leadership skills nor his passion for change. Instead, he'd lost the opportunity to exploit a favorable political environment. Now, to summarize those examples before we talk about President Trump, even presidents who appeared to dominate Congress understood their own limitations and explicitly took advantage of opportunities in their environments. Working at the margins, they successfully guided legislation through Congress. When their opportunities lessened, they reverted to the more typical stalemate that usually characterizes presidential congressional relations. So let's now turn to Donald Trump. Now, he came to Washington boasting of his prowess as a leader, able to cut deals and transform policy. It was going to be, in his words, easy, piece of cake. Okay? Now, what kind of opportunities did he have? Well, they were mixed. I've already mentioned that he lacked an electoral mandate, but he was fortunate enough to have a unified government, a great advantage. In other words, in his first 2 years, the House and the Senate were both Republican. In fact, he had the largest Republican majority in the House of any president since 1925. That's a long time. That's almost a century. However, on the other hand, Republican cohesion was imperfect on immigration, health care, a couple of things. And partisan polarization was very high in Congress, meaning the two parties were far apart, so there was nobody in the middle to sort of peel off to add to your coalition. And there was little public pressure for Democrats to abate their strong opposition because their constituencies truly hated Donald Trump and still do. Well, the president did enjoy some success. High priority tax cuts passed, and he used the bill to open oil and gas exploration in the Arctic and end the individual mandate of the Affordable Care Act. In addition, Republicans exploited the Congressional Review Act to overturn 16 agency rules adopted in the last 60 days of the Obama administration. Throughout his tenure, the president has won Senate floor votes on his nominations. And of course, we're particularly attuned to the nominations to the courts. But a surprising number of his nominations to the executive branch, and even some to the courts, didn't make it very far. His own party turned them back. They didn't come to a vote, so he didn't lose the vote. They just turned them back. Most important, however, confirming judges is no substitute for legislation. As Republican Senator Marco Rubio noted, at some point, we run out of judges. He said that with a laugh, but you understand the point. The White House also enjoyed notable success in winning approval of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement on International Trade, but this victory occurred only after Democrats won a series of major concessions. The bills designed to provide relief in response to the pandemic were even more a product of Democrat as well as Republican initiatives, were not driven by the White House, and you can watch what's happening to the current pandemic or potential pandemic bill as we speak to see the White House is not driving this. Important bills dealing with the opioid crisis, the criminal justice system, and veterans benefits also passed almost entirely congressional initiatives. In fact, a bill like the criminal justice system reform, the White House did not sign on to it till it had passed both houses of Congress. The most notable fact about Trump's legislative record is the relative absence of passage of significant presidential initiatives. Prominent among the legislation that did not pass were bills dealing with health care reform, infrastructure spending, and immigration, policies central to the president's campaign. The president's budgets proposed deep cuts in non-defense discretionary spending, and Congress simply ignored them, Democrats and Republicans alike. To cap off his first 2 years, the 115th Congress ended without funding large portions of the federal government, precipitating the largest government shutdown in U.S. history. Now, Trump's passivity in legislation, his vagueness, his inconsistency, his lack of command of policy has made him an unskilled, unreliable, and untrustworthy negotiator. You can see some of this just looking at the pandemic bill, where one day he's for it, another day he's against it, he's for it, he's against it, then he wants a small bill, now he wants a big bill. Nobody wants to negotiate with him, so they just ignore him, and they just go about their business. You can see these characteristics, as I said, in the pandemic bill, but also the fact that he hasn't had a proposal to offer. There is no White House proposal out there that the president will then negotiate around. It isn't there. He's not been successful in closing deals and convincing wavering members of Congress to support him. And he can't convince the Republican Senate. He can't even convince the Republican Senate to support the pandemic bill. They oppose him. That's why we don't have a pandemic bill right now. But they might be right, they might be wrong. We can determine that at another point. But my point is that he's a Republican leader, he's a Republican president, and the Republican Senate just ignores him. His customary tools of threat and disparagement, and he uses those a lot towards members of Congress, have gained him little. Now, an important aspect of the Trump congressional record is the small size of the agenda that reached the floor of Congress. In 2017 and 2018, he took stands at only 66 votes in the House, representing the lowest percentage of House votes in the history of calculating presidential support. In the Senate, he took even fewer stands on legislative votes, and by that I mean votes that were not nominations. He only took stands on 39 votes in 2 years in the entire United States Senate. He was doing very, very little. And he lost 7 of those, despite the Republicans holding a majority, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. Republicans strengthened their control of the Senate in the 2018 elections and continued to provide the president with victories in 2019, especially on nominations. Nevertheless, in 2019, with an enhanced Republican majority in the Senate, he lost 11 of 29 legislative votes. He lost the votes in the Senate with his own party in a majority. In addition, even with the majority, he failed to win a majority on 16 of the 29 votes. Sometimes he could win a vote because it was a vote to override his veto, and so for him to lose, the opposition would have had to get 2/3 of the votes. But he couldn't even get a majority vote on those. Moreover, only 11 of these 29 stands were supporting an action. The rest of the time, the House was opposing initiatives. And this is a recurrent point here, is that the president just hasn't had much of an agenda. He hasn't been trying to do very much. The number of opposing stances would have been even greater if Mitch McConnell had not refused to take up nearly 300 bills passed by the Democratic House. Trump didn't fill the void, neglecting even to offer an outline of goals. His record was even worse in the Democratic House. He took stances on only 62 votes. 95% of those stances were in opposition to the passage of legislation. And ultimately, of course, the House impeached him, which generally is not viewed by a president as success. Congress displayed its independence in other ways, such as voting to overturn his declaration of a national emergency to fund a border wall, voting to end the U.S. military support of the Saudi-led war in Yemen, and voting to block the president from using military force abroad. In each case, he successfully vetoed these bills after these embarrassing defeats. The bottom line here is that the president simply has given up legislating. He simply is not sending legislation to Congress. He doesn't have an agenda. And we can see this lack of agenda right before us in his current election strategy. Normally, when a president seeks re-election, the election is a referendum on that president, quite naturally. How have I performed in the last 4 years? I performed well, the president would say, so vote for me and we'll continue. Let us continue. But this president doesn't want a referendum on his performance because he'll lose if that's the choice that Americans face. Most Americans didn't think highly of him before the pandemic, and they view him as having failed to protect them from it, so they're not keen on his performance. So if the president didn't want voters to look backwards, perhaps they could look forwards. What would he do in a second term? And he could tell them what he would do. So vote for me, and here's what I will do for you. Now, this is a good question. What would he do? The president has chosen not to present an agenda for a second term. In fact, the Republican National Convention had no platform at all. To fill in the blank at the last minute, because they had no platform for 2020. I don't recall this ever happening before in American history. So what they did, they took the 2016 platform, the platform from 4 years ago, and they just passed it again. They repassed the 2016 platform and said, that's our platform. So this shows you there's just nothing there. So the president, instead of looking forward or looking backwards, is trying to frame the election as a referendum, but not on himself, on Joe Biden. In other words, he wants to frame the election as a choice rather than a referendum, a choice. And the basic argument is that a Biden administration would be much worse than a second Trump term. Now, you can agree with that or disagree, but anyhow, that's the president's basic electoral strategy. The president's response to his failure to persuade the public or Congress has been to push the boundaries of presidential power and violate the norms of the presidency. He's turned increasingly to unilateral action. His remark that I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president reflects this orientation. For example, when Congress explicitly refused to fund a wall on the Mexican border, the president chose to dip into defense funds to pay for the wall. This action has been ruled unconstitutional by a U.S. Court of Appeals, and it's now going to the Supreme Court. When both parties of Congress refused to cut Social Security taxes, which is what the president wanted to do to boost the economy during this pandemic, the president used his discretion not to collect taxes. And it's not possible to characterize the president as a successful leader of Congress. Now, please remember, my goal has not been to tell you for whom to vote. I began this lecture by saying that what I was about to tell you would be true whatever your view of the president's policies. Instead, I've tried to explain to you how successful the president has been or not been in his efforts to obtain support for those policies. We find the president has not succeeded in leading either the public or Congress. And recognizing this himself, the president has at this point forsaken leadership and turned to acting alone. I thank you for your attention, and now I welcome your questions.
Thank you, George, for that wonderful presentation. I love the Q&A sessions of a talk because this is an opportunity for all of us to ask the speaker lots of questions, and I'm going to invoke my executive privilege to ask the first one. You know, one of the things that really strikes me when I teach a class in the presidency and I introduce the students to some of your work, one of the things that often surprised them is that, you know, despite our perception of presidents as leaders of this country and are able to really motivate and drives the public, if you will, what you're telling us is that oftentimes that's more the exception, not the norm. Um, why why is there this such a mismatch between our popular perceptions of what presidents can do versus what they can actually accomplish?
That's a very interesting question, you. And I think we tend to we tend to glorify individuals. We simplify decision making. Well, understanding American history. So we understand American history. There's the Washington administration. Well, there's the FDR, the New Deal. So it's FDR, right? That's what we need to know. Uh, and so we just naturally then attribute whatever happened to the president's leadership. And of course, presidents campaign. They spend literally hundreds of millions of dollars in their campaign of both parties, right? Trying to convince you that if they are elected, wonderful things are going to happen because they are elected. Because they are elected, they are going, and they convince you that they are wonderful leaders. And Donald Trump is certainly no exception to that. I'm a wonderful leader. I'm doing a great job, and don't you forget it. And so elect me, right? So it simplifies reality. We tend to learn history this way, and we have a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of people trying to convince us of this. But the fact is that when we actually look at what happens, that's not the way the world really works. And presidents have a terrible time trying to move public opinion, no matter how eloquent they are, no matter how skilled they are before the TV camera or before a crowd. They simply have a very, very difficult time. It hardly ever happens for reasons that I briefly outlined. And Congress, I mean, Congress is independent. They've got there's a lot of other influences on members of Congress. Think about it. They've got party. They've got personal commitments. They've got political views policy views that they've had for a very long time. They've got their constituencies. So the president is one of many factors, but mostly they've made up their minds before the president gets to them. So presidents do not spend a lot of time on the phone for each vote trying to move members of Congress. Sometimes in a really, 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 really significant piece of legislation, they do. And they tend to have mixed results. But usually, do they call people who disagree with them? Absolutely not. They don't call anybody who disagrees with them. I mean, none. The people they call, the list that they're given by their aides, are people who are on the margins or might be for them, but are worried about something and weakening a little bit. Those are the people they call. They can virtually never convince someone on the other side to change their minds. And that virtually never happens. We have a purposely inefficient system. That's our constitutional system. It's designed that way. And so power is highly decentralized. The whole system is very, very complicated. And so we should not expect a president to dominate the system, certainly not for very long. In a rare instance, when there is a perception that a presidential candidate has received a mandate for policies that they proposed in the campaign, and that's very rare. The last time was probably Ronald Reagan in the 1980 campaign. It's not typical. All presidents claim mandates, but they're almost always wrong. And we know that because we asked the people, do they have a mandate? Do you want Congress to just defer to this guy? So we know a great deal about this. But if there is a sense of a mandate, then Congress for a few months is extra deferential, but it's a few months, not a few years. We have to understand that. That's just not the way the world works. Well, that's a long-winded answer to your very good question. I hope I've made some progress in answering that.
Thank you. I have more questions, but I think we should let everybody else a chance to ask them. So if you have a question for Dr. Edwards, please use the raise your hand feature in the participants panel, or you can type your question so we can call on you. Or if you prefer, please type your question into the chat, and we have a question already in the chat, so I'll read it to you.
Okay.
What is your perspective on if the Electoral College will eventually be dissolved and the country will use the actual popular vote to elect the president and vice president?
Very, very good question. As you may know, I wrote a book entitled "Why the Electoral College is Bad for America," and so I have a strong view on this. It's now in its third edition. Uh, it's hard to change because it's become a partisan issue. Majority of the American public, and every poll that I've ever seen, going back to the late 1930s, wants direct popular election of the president. Add up all the votes, whoever gets the most votes wins. Because it's hard to justify some people's votes counting more than other people's votes, which is what happens in the Electoral College. But because the Republicans have gained the presidency twice in this century, because of the Electoral College, while losing the popular vote, they feel they have a stake in it. It gives them a stake. And so it's become a partisan issue. So Democrats overwhelmingly want to get rid of Electoral College, Independents want to get rid of Electoral College, and Republicans, on average, don't want to get rid of the Electoral College. Now, I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding, and that's why I wrote the book, about what the Electoral College does and doesn't do for people. It doesn't actually do very much. It doesn't protect small state interests. It doesn't do the things that people think it does. There is a mechanism that that it calls for an interstate compact among states. And the states create an interstate compact and promise to give their electoral votes to whoever gets the most votes in the nation. Now, states representing about, I think about 180 electoral votes right now. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact number in my head. Have actually signed on to this, and when it hits, the total would be half of the electoral votes, representing, well, plus one of the electoral votes in the country. Then it would affect change the whole election, and it would become a popular election without changing the Constitution. But it's hard to get these Republican states to sign on to something that they think is going to hurt them. I mean, that they won't win the election if they do, while losing the popular vote. And Republicans have only won, if you think about it, the Democrats won the popular vote in 92, 96, 2000, 2008, 2012, 2016, and they're going to win it in 2020 easily. So in all those elections, the Republicans have won the popular vote once. In 2004. So they see that this is the only way that we can win elections. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to change under these circumstances, change the Constitution because of the rules of changing the Constitution. Go ahead.
Thank you. Again, if you have a question, please enter it into chat or raise your hand in the participants panel. With this many people on a call, I can't really see if you raised your hand in your video. We do have another question in chat. Why do you believe Trump has been unsuccessful in expanding his tribe outside of his base and seemingly ignores the racial tensions exhibited during his term?
Well, I think the first part of that question is, excuse me, why has he not been able to expand? And the reasons that I gave, the nature. Well, first of all, there is the nature of his policies. I think people don't like his policies, so they're not attracted because they don't like his policies. Now you might say, well, isn't that expanding your base, getting, and so there's the same problem. He can't expand support for himself, and he can't expand support for his policies. But I also think that the reasons that I indicated about the nature of his public discourse, which is demeaning people, and most folks don't like that. Even Republicans say, we should put up the Twitter. Even Republicans say that. You don't need to be demeaning people all the time. And you don't need to be lying all the time, which he does routinely. You might say that all politicians lie. There's some truth in that. But if you took all the lies that you've ever been able to identify from all the politicians, national politics or presidents, put them all together, it'd be a small fraction of Donald Trump's. I don't know what it is about him. He just doesn't seem to care. And when you go out and like right now, the president's saying, look, we've got the pandemic. It's just about to end. Well, all you have to do is look at data, which is readily available, easy to understand, that the pandemic is surging. It's surging. It might be the worst that is yet to come that we've had. I don't know. I'm not predicting pandemics. That's not my specialty. All I'm saying is it's clearly not going away. Now, why would you do something like that? Why would you say something like that? Because all people have to do is look. They have to look at their TV screen. They have to look at their newspaper, wherever they know that's not true. They know that that's not true. So the president is undermining himself. And I hate to see this. And I also think that there's more long-term problems, consequences for public discourse, because I think it's lowering public discourse in general and making it more acceptable to have public discourse in this fashion. I don't think it's good. It's good for America for this to be acceptable nature of public discourse.
We have another question that was related to electoral college, and it was sort of a suggested proposal. And the question is, would having more states move away from winner take all be a feasible solution?
That's a very good question. And winner take all is indeed the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem, and it's something, by the way, the framers never thought about. They never expected it for 1 second. James Madison was appalled when it came in. It came in afterwards. We didn't have parties, so we didn't have unit voting for a party. The founders didn't expect electoral college to work this way at all. But unfortunately, simply doing that is not, will not solve the problem. Because of gerrymandering and because of the distribution of votes in congressional districts, and that's the normal way that states think about doing it, it would still distort the election outcomes. Donald Trump would have won this last time the same way, even though losing the popular vote by 3 million votes. Now, you could say, well, look, we're going to just do the percentage. We're not going to care about where you got it in congressional votes. We'll do the percentage. But there's unless you got a really big state with a lot of electoral votes, that it's too rough. There's too much rounding error, if you will. And so it just doesn't translate popular votes into electoral votes accurately enough. So that there's one way, it's a good thought. It just won't do the job.
Okay, next question. Professor Edwards, you mentioned 2 factors in your model explaining successful presidential leadership of Congress. 1, a national crisis, and 2, unified government. If Trump had crises in 2016 that we have now, racial inequality and COVID, when he had unified government, would he been better positioned to show leadership then?
If we had a civil rights crisis, let us say, in 2016, the president wouldn't have been in front of that. The president would have been on the other side. That's so. It wouldn't have helped him. It would have just encouraged more polarization. Crisis can help a president in some occasions, but not all. Let's just take George W. Bush. After the 9/11 attacks, his approval rating literally overnight went from, it was just about to dip below 50%. And then it went up to 87% and ultimately 90%. But it went up to 80%, 87% before it had done anything, right? That was a rally around the country. That was, of course, a peculiarly traumatic crisis. And he stayed, it started coming down slowly, but it was slow. Then we the war in Iraq, and then there's a crisis, right? For a few days, we had a quick victory. That was great. Everyone's happy. And then we had the aftermath, which, of course, is still going on. We're still experiencing it. And so he ends up in the 20s. We got a crisis. We got something terrible is happening, right? And then on top of that, we have another crisis. We have, if you recall, the financial crisis, which struck approximately August, September of 2008. So you got a foreign policy crisis and you got a domestic policy crisis, and it was very serious. As we all know, that was that wasn't just another recession. That was big time, serious recession. Okay, so he's got two crises. Is he going up in the polls? Is Congress saying, hey, let's do business? No, he's going down in the polls. He's getting down in the high 20s. So he became extremely unpopular. So it's not just having a crisis, but are you getting blamed for the crisis? You're getting blamed for not performing in the crisis. I mean, we have a crisis right now with the pandemic. That's one of our crises, as the questioner pointed out. But this is hurting the president, not helping the president. And it's hurting the president because people do not see him performing well in response to it, and they don't think he's telling the truth. So they don't think they can trust him. So they have much more trust in science and Dr. Fauci than in Trump. And we have lots and lots of data on Trump versus Fauci. You can choose whomever you want, but I'm telling you that the American public overwhelmingly choose Fauci. 2-1. Yeah, 2-1, he wins. So a crisis doesn't necessarily do the job.
And we have a question from the audience from Dr. Saul Lerner, who is a professor of history here.
I see him there. Hi.
Saul?
Hi. Thank you so much for your comments, first of all. Secondly, Daley has written two books, one in 2017 and one in 2020, a brand new book entitled Unrigged. What he talks about is the way in which the Republican Party has been enormously effective in rigging the vote in behalf of their presidential candidate. As the Electoral College, when California, with 40 million voters, and Utah with approximately less than 1 million voters vote, what it means is a very lopsided vote. And this is one of the points that is made with regard to the book Unrigged and its predecessor volume. I wonder if you could comment on the rigging of the vote and the consequences in terms of the 2020 election.
Well, the greatest criticism regarding rigging the vote, I mean, the Electoral College is a vote itself, but it's there. I mean, we can't blame it on the Republicans.
Yeah.
We can blame it keeping it on Republicans now, because
Right.
they're the ones who are keeping us from changing it.
Gerrymandering and other things are relevant.
Gerrymandering rigs the vote for Congress, but not for president.
Yeah.
And of course, Democrats in the past gerrymandered, so it's a bipartisan
Oh yeah.
motivation for gerrymandering. But right now, the Republicans have had the advantage because they've controlled more states. So they've done absurd things in some states. North Carolina is a perfect example
Yep.
of what has happened, where Democrats get most of the votes and Republicans win most of the seats. So what's going on here? It's also the case that the United States Senate, in principle, is rigged. So Republicans get much more power from many fewer votes because of the Senate, because where they tend to elect senators. So we have a number of broad features in American government which prevent the translation of popular votes directly into seats, into power, into officials. But there's also another matter, and this is the matter of vote suppression. Now, I don't want to tar a party, but there certainly have been efforts many places to diminish the vote, and it's particularly diminish the Democratic vote, to make it harder for in areas where Democrats. In Texas, right now, the governor has decided that we could only have one drop-off box per county. Now, we have a lot of small counties. We have 254 counties in Texas, so we got a lot of counties. And a few of those counties have a lot of people. I mean, we have 6 of the 20 biggest cities in the country in Texas. They have a lot of people, and they tend to vote Democratic, right? So Harris County, which has Houston, Harris County, a couple of million people, one box. Now you can have a county with 200 people, way out in West Texas where hardly anyone lives, and one box. Okay, so now I don't know the heart of the governor, but I think if I were governor, I could have figured out a way to have more than one box in Harris County. But it just turns out, of course, that these big cities have Democratic votes, right? Amazing. Well, there's all kinds of other things. What Florida's doing about felon voting and et cetera, or former felons, ex-felons, I should say. There are many versions of this. Cutting off times for early voting, et cetera. There's, making it less convenient for people, particularly people who work for a wage, who don't have flexibility in their schedules, making it harder for them to vote. So there's lots of things like that. And it has been something the Republicans are particularly interested in following up on, and under the heading, well, we're trying to prevent fraud. Now, frankly, we have such little fraud in voting in America. It's so little compared to tens of millions of votes, tens of millions and tens of millions and tens of millions and tens of millions. We hardly find any fraud at all. We have lots of data on this, hardly find any fraud at all. So one might be suspicious of motivations, but not all Republicans are that way. There's some that are that way. And I think it's unfortunate. So that would be my comment on that one. I see we have lots of other questions here, so I don't see the questions. I just see the chat box has lots
okay.
of.
Next question is from Hannah, and her question is: in your opinion, how can Trump improve his rhetoric so that public opinion changes, or can it change at all?
Well, the president could improve his rhetoric by not doing the kinds of things that I suggested were problems for him earlier. But now it's too late. I mean, it is too late. People have well-defined views of Donald Trump. So, he can't go like the other day. In fact, several times he's saying to suburban women, like me, please like me, please like me. That's not going to do the job. If he sustained a policy, if he were reelected in 4 years, where, stopped demeaning people, started being really straightforward and honest, et cetera, then I think that slowly more people might be open to him. But nothing will happen fast. Nothing happened fast. And one should never expect presidents to change very many people's opinions. It just doesn't happen. So that's why it's so important to understand that the essence of leadership is not creating opportunities for change, not changing people's opinion, but it's recognizing the opportunities that are there and then exploiting them fully. So if you have majorities in both houses of Congress, then you should exploit that. You should do an LBJ. First of all, you got to have agenda. You got to have legislation. The president didn't have that. And then push it through. Push it through when you have the opportunity. This particular president has not done that. He's not the only one who has ever failed to do that, but he is not. But it's recognizing and exploiting those opportunities. And I use the word exploiting in a perfectly neutral sense. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. I have an opportunity because I have people who want to basically vote the way for legislation of the type that I would propose. So let's get together and move on here. The president has not been able to do that. He's not been able to negotiate successfully on immigration. He's not been able to get an infrastructure bill. He's not been able to negotiate successfully on health care. In fact, and it's such a problem that if you recall in 2019, the president said, we're going to do health care. And Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, called him and said, we're not going to do health care. We're not going to do anything about health care. I don't want to hear about health care before this election in 2020. I don't want to hear about it because that's only going to hurt us. It's going to hurt us in the election if we try to do health care because people aren't going to like what we're going to do. So that took care of that one. Anyhow, better get to the next question.
Our next question is, you made a comment earlier, why would you follow someone you don't believe? This is very true. So what does that say about the intelligence and motive of our elected officials?
Well, that's a good question. That's a really interesting question. And we'll particularly just focus on Donald Trump. I'm not sure that I don't know what it says about his intelligence, but I think that it says something about his personality, that he simply cannot stop himself. He is an impulsive person. He's an impulsive person, and he has a lot of grievances, and he has to exercise his demons. And so the very first thing he does is insult people. Yesterday, apparently, he was filming something with Leslie Stahl in 60 Minutes, and he didn't like the way the questions were going, apparently. I don't know the question, so I don't know. And so he immediately sends a Twitter out, with threats and criticism of her personally. Now, it's perfectly fine to say, I don't like this question, I don't think this is a fair question, and say it to her, and say it on while it's being filmed, and then say, here's what I think. But there's no need to go after Leslie Stahl. But that's just the latest of literally thousands of examples. And anybody can look at his Twitter archive. It's there. You can look at it free of charge. You can see all the people he's demeaned, including many, many people on his own team. Many people on his own team. Look at what he said about his former Secretary of State, his former Chief of Staff. I mean, you can just go his former Secretary of Defense. And these are pretty distinguished people, These are not sleazeball people. These are extraordinary people, and people to be commended for their public service. And yet that's what he does. That's exactly, and it's just part of him.
Our next question is very timely in today's media environment, and the question is, with so much disinformation being fed to both sides and the apparent social dilemma that provides the continuation of questionable information, can you recommend where one can go to actually find factual and unbiased information regarding statements presented as facts?
Well, there are several answers to that. First thing, I would recommend if someone wanted to invest an hour a day being informed, just an hour a day, I'd go to the PBS NewsHour. I think it's an extraordinary show, and and that's accessible, and it's very balanced and accurate. That's one thing. Now there are fact checkers. If you want to get into the nitty gritty, there PolyFact, the New York Times, and the Washington Post have checkers. No doubt there are many others that I don't even know about. But there are who will give you details about information if you are concerned, and you can do searches for those. So you can put in, fact checker, Washington Post or something, and an issue, and I think you'll be able to get information on that. But I think the best thing of all is to be just routinely informed on a day-by-day basis.
And the next question is, do you think there would be straight ticket voting this year, maybe compared to previous years?
Yeah, I absolutely guarantee you there will be straight ticket voting. Almost all the voting will be straight ticket voting. We have been setting records in each succeeding election in straight ticket voting, and I don't anticipate that there'll be much change now. And so it has become all politics is national. We used to say knowingly, all politics is local. Now all politics is national. And so people do straight ticket voting. So that's what you should anticipate seeing.
And the next question is from Roger, and also a student here. Why do we let elected officials tell us what to do with our taxpayer money? So they're public servants, they're supposed to represent us, but it seems that they have an agenda of their own that's not the same as the public's.
Well, the answer to that, I mean, that may be true, that they have a different agenda than the public, and sometimes that's true and sometimes it's not. If it's true very often, the public has a mechanism for getting rid of them, so that's one thing. But the fact is that we elect the officials to use our money. That's what we do. I mean, that's why one of the things we elect them for. So I don't know any way around that. So if they're using our tax money in ways that we don't want them to use it, then we should vote against them.
And perhaps one last question, George, if you don't mind.
Sure.
This is from Jasmine, and she's going to ask you her question.
Hi, Dr. Edwards.
Hi.
So my main question was, I was really curious. You were mentioning all the different rhetoric that the president has used and how it's affected the people's opinion of him. I just wanted to kind of understand your opinion of how he approached the situation with the white supremacists and the way that he was saying be on standby during, I believe it was the debate.
Yeah. Well, you know, this is a good question, and it's not easy to answer. I'm trying to be as fair as possible. I don't think that the president. There are some people who think the president is a racist. In fact, a lot of people in America, when we take polls and just ask that simple question, a lot of people think the president's a racist. I don't know if the president's a racist or not. What I do know is that he's known from the beginning that he does not have the support of the American public. I mean, he can cherry pick and find some poll that seems to indicate that he's positive, but he knows overwhelmingly that he's been 44% basically all the time. And so he's never had the support of the American public. And he is the first president that I know of in American history who's actually running a campaign that is geared to winning the election without winning the vote. This is the first president that I know of in American history who's ever tried to do that. He knows he can't win the vote. Okay. So I say that as a prelude to the real answer. And the real answer is the president has a difficult time rejecting anyone who will support him. And so, yes, he will say, yes, of course I'm against white supremacists, but will he ever raise it on his own? No, he will never do that on his own, because he knows something about his base. And and most Republicans are not racist. Let's understand that. Most Trump voters are not racist, but the base, Trump voters, we know of a lot of data. We have lots and lots of data. And we know that these are folks who have higher levels of what we call racial resentment. I won't go into all the details, but we have this scale. We don't say, are you a racist? We don't say, are you a bigot? That's not the kind of question we ask, because you never get a sensible answer. So there's a series of questions that pollsters ask, and I'm talking about academic pollsters, not political pollsters, if you will, ask to try to determine what people's real sense are about race and race relations in America. So we'll just call this the racial resentment scale for the moment, okay? And we know that people who support Donald Trump, on average, are much more likely to have racial resentment than people who don't. They're much more likely to say, for example, and this is kind of amazing to most of us, to say, well, I face just as much discrimination as a white person as black people do. There's no difference. Or I face greater discrimination. Now, it's kind of astonishing to most of us to hear such things. But nevertheless, large percentages of Trump's base answer in this way. So I think the president is aware of this and doesn't want to go out of his way to irritate them. And so he doesn't. Same way that, what we'll call the right-wing militias, okay? We'll just lump everybody together, be a little oversimplified here. He doesn't go out of his way to reject them, to stick his finger in their eye, right? He doesn't want to irritate his base. So this, I think, is his basic response, rather than him saying, yes, I just can't stand black people. You know, I just can't stand African Americans or Latinos. I mean, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's my guess of what's truly in his head. But I think that's his motivation for why he says what he says.
And when I said that was the last question, I kind of lied because I want to use my unilateral authority to ask the last question. George, you mentioned during the presentation that you're not a forecaster, but I'm going to ask you to put on your forecasting hat for a little bit. And you noted that a lot of a good part of Congress's reaction to Trump since he's been in office has been that they've largely ignored him. What would you say might the consequence of that be for future administrations, and or is what we're seeing right now uniquely to Trump?
Well, I think some of it's unique to Trump because many Republicans, I mean, Democrats, of course, don't like him, never liked him, never will like him. Republicans, at various times when it was to their advantage, because his base is so strong and it's a Republican base, love him. They really love him, that they've had to go along. But they don't want to go out of their way to associate with him if they don't have to. And right now, one of the things that you see as Republican senatorial candidates in tight races are just having nothing to do with Trump. Donald Trump doesn't appear in their advertisements. He doesn't. They just have nothing to do with him at all. They're not saying, elect me so I can go to Washington and help support Donald Trump. That's not what they're saying, because he's so unpopular. Now, I think a new president would not necessarily face the same kind of antagonism that Donald Trump does. And I'm not just focused on Joe Biden per se. I anticipate that he'll be elected, but things can happen. So anyhow, but at any rate, I don't know that Trump has cleared the deal, forever. That there'll never be good relationships between the president and Congress. I think it's entirely possible, and I think Biden is the kind of guy who, just because of his personality and his long service in Congress, might find it easier to restore some of the comity that we might have. But we're still going to have polarized politics. Republicans are not going to like Biden. They're not going to want to. They're not going to be wanting to give him great victories and don't want him to look good. Just like Democrats wouldn't want a Republican to look good. So that's going to continue. But I think that we can do a bit of healing. I think that's possible.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And one last time, let's give Dr. Edwards a big round of applause for his awesome presentation today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Thank you all for joining us, and please tune in for the next speaker series from Chess. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye, George. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye-bye.